Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's session of the Washington History Seminar, Historical Perspectives on International and National Affairs. This afternoon, we are featuring a book by Maurice J. Casey entitled Hotel Lux, An Intimate History of Communism's Forgotten Radicals, published in October by Footnote Press. Our discussant this afternoon is Lisa Kirschenbaum of Westchester University. I'm Eric Arneson from George Washington University. I co-chair the Washington History Seminar with Christian Osterman of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. Christian is traveling internationally today and can't join us. As some of you know, the seminar, launched in 2010, has been a collaborative and nonpartisan initiative of the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy program and the American Historical Association. Before March of 2020, we gathered in person at the Wilson Center here in Washington, D.C. Since the summer of that year, well, we've been gathering here online, assembling participants from across the country and across the globe. And our participants this afternoon join us from the United Kingdom and from Amsterdam. A few quick things before we get started. As always, I like to recognize the key figure whose behind-the-scenes labor makes these seminars possible, and that's Pete Bierstecker of the Wilson Center. Second, please take note, our next session of the Washington History Seminar takes place in 1 week's time on Monday, February 10th, 2025 at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. We will reconvene to discuss Book and Dagger, How Scholars and Librarians Became the Unlikely Spies of World War II by Elise Graham. Hope you can join us. Third, on the logistics front, today's session is being recorded and can soon be found on the Washington History Seminar's YouTube page, where many dozens of past programs are archived. And finally, when we get to the question and answer section of the webinar, we ask those of you with questions to use the raise hand function or the Q&A function on Zoom, and we'll call on as many folks as we can. All right, business is taken care of. We can move on. Maurice Casey is an historian based at Queen's University, Belfast. His work focuses on the history of modern Ireland, queer history, and the history of international communism in the interwar world. He holds degrees from Trinity College Dublin, Cambridge University, and the University of Oxford, where he completed his doctoral studies in 2020. He was a Fulbright Scholar at Stanford from 2018 to 2019, and his writing has appeared in a variety of publications, including History Today, the Irish Times, and Tribune magazine. Hotel Lux, An Intimate History of the Communism's Forgotten Radicals, is his first book and the subject of today's discussion. Maurice, welcome to the Washington History Seminar. Screen's all yours.
Oh, great. Well, thanks so much, Eric, and thank you as well to Christian and to Peter and to the Washington History Seminar for the invitation to speak with you all this evening. And it's great to see so many people joining us as well. So to begin, I'm going to introduce my book, and I'll take about 20 minutes or so, and I hope to kind of give an overview for people who may not know about the Hotel Lux, who may not really be familiar with the history of the Comintern more broadly. And certainly people will not be familiar with many of my central figures in my book. So I'm going to bring up a PowerPoint, which will really just be images that will help kind of introduce you to the main characters in the book. So everyone can see that okay. So as Eric mentioned, I'm normally based at Queen's University in Belfast, though right at the moment I'm joining you from Cambridge University, where I am currently a visiting fellow at Sydney Sussex College. So my book, Hotel Lux, which came out in last August, I'm just going to turn on a timer to make sure I don't go over time, is the first full-length English language study of the Hotel Lux, which is a really crucial and pivotal location in the history of the Communist International. The book itself focuses on three interlocking family histories, whose converging point is this Moscow hotel, and it's based on 7 years of research in more than 25 archives with documents in 4 different languages. Where it sits in terms of historiography is within the historiography of the Communist International, and particularly a recent transnational history pioneered by people like Brigitte Studer and Lisa Kirschenbaum, who's joining us this evening. And I guess as a publishing model, of history as well. It's quite distinct in that this began life as my PhD thesis, but instead of publishing it as an academic monograph, I turned it into a narrative nonfiction book. We can talk more about that in the Q&A and why I chose to do that. The methodology of the book is also linked into the kind of arising history of intimacy. So the book takes love and friendship seriously as engines of historical and revolutionary change by examining the lives and afterlives of this single group of friends that I identify as part of the research. There are also four chapters in the book of archival memoir, chapters where I speak in the first person about my process of researching the book. Um, this is my first of two sales pitches. There'll be one at the end, but it is available to buy now. It's also an ebook. And if you want to hear 13 more hours of me, it's also an audiobook narrated by me. But let's begin by just asking, what was the Hotel Lux? What made it important? The Hotel Lux was established in 1913 by a wealthy Moscow baking dynasty. It's located quite centrally in Moscow. Its former site no longer exists, but it was at 36 Borskaya Street, so quite central, about a 30-minute, 35-minute walk to the Kremlin. In after the Russian Revolution of 1917 and the establishment of the Communist International in 1919, it is seized by the Bolsheviks and turned into the dormitory, or one of several dormitories of the Communist International, and becomes a place where many of the famous visiting revolutionaries of the era stay at some period in their movement through international communism. The memory of the Lux, the historical memory of the Lux, is really shaped by the late 1930s and a German language memoir scholarship of anti-Nazi exiles who arrived there after 1933. Ostensibly, the early Politburo of East Germany was formed within the Hotel Lux. My book focuses on this hotel in a different period, an earlier period in the 1920s, and particularly from 1924 to 1928, that is to say, the interregnum between Lenin's death and Stalin's rise. I don't see my book as a definitive history of this hotel. I think that the hotel itself is a kind of kaleidoscope through which we can perceive many paths and routes through the 20th century, but rather it's a history of a particular social circle. And to introduce you to that social circle, I may as well introduce you to the person who led me into it, which is this woman, May O'Callaghan. My PhD thesis was about Irish women and international communism. One of the women that I came across, and I could essentially say discovered as part of the research because she hadn't been written about before, was this woman, May O'Callaghan, who was born in Wexford in Ireland in 1881, grew up in a rural Irish village called Ballinesker, and is, in Irish terms, quite remarkable in that in the late 19th century, she studied at the University of Vienna. She could speak fluent French and German. And she was also quite politically active before she arrived at the hotel in 1924. She first enters the historical record, really speaking in her own voice, on the pages of the Workers' Dreadnought, which was a left-wing feminist newspaper published in East London, initially began just on the eve of the First World War. May O'Callaghan, after her time in Vienna, arrived in London in 1914 and became sub-editor of this revolutionary newspaper, which was edited by Sylvia Pankhurst, the revered suffragette. What's important to May's story and her eventual journey to the hotel were these two women, two sisters whom she met through her work in East London, Rose and Nellie Cohen, East London Jewish sisters. Now, all three of these women, May, Nellie, and Rose, would end up at the Hotel Lux. Nellie as a visitor, but Rose and May as residents of the hotel. Part of what I argued in my PhD thesis, which was really about Irish women who were involved in the suffrage struggle, who moved into communism, was that one interesting way of looking at this transition from suffrage to communism was to look at it not so much as an ideological transition, but as a transference of skill sets. Suffrage was really moved by secretarially trained women who knew how to work things like a mimeograph machine, who knew all these technical skills that made them very useful to international organizations after the First World War, be they the Communist International or the League of Nations. So when I came to write my book, Hotel Lux, I really wanted to focus in on the era which fascinated me most about Mayo Collins' life, and that was her time working in the Comintern in 1924, from 1924 to 1928, when she lived in room 5 of the Hotel Lux. So I normally show this picture because it's quite a well-known Comintern picture, but I think it really demonstrates really well the gendered nature of Comintern work. So the Communist International formed in 1919 with the intention of spreading the Bolshevik model around the world. It was the organizing body of world communist parties. Like any international organization, it required a lot of simply administrative labor. And if you look at this picture, you see Lenin on the rostrum, other familiar figures. But if we zoom in beneath Lenin, we see the stenography team, the people who are working with shorthand, all women. So this kind of up close history was what I was interested in, and getting into the lived experience of these technical workers who are very rarely foregrounded in histories of internationalism. So in Comintern parlance, they were called the techniczki robotniki, the technical workers. And again, it's not a coincidence that so many women, in fact, 4 women from this one small East London radical group, would end up working in the press department of this Moscow office. It's because of a transference of skill sets. It's also about multilingual worlds. East London was a site of Eastern European Jewish migration, and it's where Mayo Callahan, this Irish woman, first began picking up the Russian language. So by the time she arrives in Moscow in 1924, she's very unusual as an Irish migrant, as a woman who's multilingual and living a kind of independent life and in Moscow, but she's not unusual within the class of Comintern workers who all tend to have these quite cosmopolitan backgrounds and in many cases have these technical skill sets that make them very useful to the Comintern apparatus. So Mayo Callahan and her life in room 5 became the kind of central point by which I traced out her social circle within the Lux, some of whom were these people who worked with her on the translation team, who all become, in different ways, figures within the book. On the left, you have Elise Sabo-Shabarovsky, a German radical who worked in press translation in German to English. She'd spent some time in Canada, so she was very efficient in English. You have Yevgenia Bouvier, who appears briefly in the book. She, I believe, was the woman who first taught Mayo Callahan Russian in East London. Ruth Kennel, an American librarian, also works as a stenographer, and Joseph Freeman, who's perhaps, of all the figures in my book, one of the better known figures, certainly in US history. And it was his memoir, An American Testament, that really helped me identify Mayo Callahan when I started the research. So my book examines this world of particularly Anglophone Hotel Lux residents, and it follows them from morning really to after hours and in their time in the hotel in the second part of the book. After hours is a really important time in terms of how we think of Comintern historiography because it can be a hard one to access. What was remarkable about Mayo Callahan as someone who was multilingual is that her hotel room became a crossing point of German revolutionaries, Soviet intellectuals, and American and British visitors. And so this is an example of one of the intellectual visitors that was often seen in a room, Sergei Dynamov, who was one of the heads of the Anglo-American section of the State Publishing House in Moscow. Now, of course, another aspect of after hours life in a hotel where or a lot of people are in their 20s and single or far away from their partner is, of course, sex and romance. And that's another thread that I pulled through the book, particularly through Joseph Freeman, who documented his quite prolific romantic life in the hotel in rich detail. So, for example, he had his girlfriend for a time when he lived in the Hotel Lux was this woman, Louise Geisler, a German revolutionary who eventually left him for M.N. Roy, the major Indian revolutionary figure. So you see how these kind of intimate romantic entanglements became entwined in wider international political intrigue. Something I tried to thread through the book as well is this kind of subjective factor. It mattered that by the standards of the time, Joseph Freeman was regarded as very good looking. In fact, a kind of a shoe-in for a doppelganger for the silent film star Rudolph Valentino. I was also interested in looking at politics and love through other intimate worlds, and in particular through family. And this led me to the story that became really the narrative engine for the book, which is the story of these two children, one who spent her first year within the hotel, the other who was born because of events that took place within it, and both of whose life stories were connected to my central figure of May O'Callaghan. For the first child born, you see her pictured here on the left with her mother. That's Elisa Leonhard. Her mother, Emmy Leonhard, was a German communist who came to the Lux in 1924, and her father was a prominent Dutch trade unionist by the name of Edo Fimmen. These children, you see here, Elisa and Emmy once more, and then Edo, the father, and a picture of all three of them together. These children and tracing these children allowed me also to move beyond state and personal archives and find private archives. So I traced this family and I traced their family material. And one of the really remarkable sources that I found as part of this research for the book was this handwritten newspaper, the Alpenpost, which was created from 1934 to 1939 by the two Leonhard children. Elisa had another little sister born a few years after her. And they created this journal to update their father on their activities when the family was separated due to their father's activity in the anti-Nazi resistance. And it's a really rich, intimate source that survived in the possession of Emmy and Edo's grandson, Pedro. The other family and child that becomes central to the narrative of the book is the family of the Cohens, these two sisters who I mentioned that May befriended in East London and whom also ended up in the hotel as well. Nellie Cohen, her daughter Joyce, was born from a one-night stand with the famous Irish novelist Liam O'Flaherty, whose works in Russian translation May was responsible for bringing into production. Because May had introduced Nellie to Liam, the father of her daughter, May felt partly responsible for this child's upbringing and birth, and so leaves the hotel behind in 1928 to help Nellie with her pregnancy. And Nellie eventually gives birth to her baby Joyce in New York in 1929. So through these family archives of the Leonhard family and the Cohen family, I was able to trace a real intimate after effect of this period in the hotel. I could trace these two women and who they grew up to be. Elisa here on the left, who was worked in international organizations like the UN, and Joyce on the right, who became a pianist in London. But what I also found, which I really wasn't expecting to find in this research, was that these two women, Elisa and Joyce, both of whom had this connection to May O'Callaghan, and both of whose lives were really wrapped up with the history of international communism, also met on the other side of the Second World War and fell in love. And so by tracing the love letters or tracing the personal archives of both of these families, I found love letters between these two women, Elisa and Joyce. And so finding that relationship for me really shaped the what this book was to become. It really shaped the kind of narrative engine that I wanted this book to have. And dissuaded me, I guess, from framing it entirely as an academic argument, because what I wanted to use was this opportunity to go into depth, go into detail on the creation of one romance that could not be understood without this wider context. of the Comintern, of the Russian Revolution, and of these diaspora networks that crossed across the world. So um, this is the kind of the overarching story of the book. Don't worry, it's not a spoiler. I kind of talk about this in the beginning, and there's lots of different stories as well that I bring into, and I do tell the kind of wider history of international communism through all these different friendships. There are some arguments, I think, within it, academic arguments, which I'll just kind of briefly outline here. At its core, I think there's an argument about the way in which people in the past never truly conform to the categories under which we study them. They are motivated by desires not even they fully understood, which means that we must follow them on an intimate level through winding archival routes if we are to arrive at a truly satisfying understanding of their lives. More prosaically, the book argues for the primary importance of language in negotiating radical lives. Language abilities became routes to advancement within Comintern networks, which proved particularly important for women seeking roles within this broader network. I also argue that the intimate relationships of ordinary activists often betrayed ideological divisions, particularly beyond the USSR. Orthodox communists remained friends with Trotskyists and so on. And this permissiveness, in fact, I believe played a role in the broader failure to comprehend the move towards the terror for communists living beyond Soviet territory. And to kind of tie up my broader introduction is just to say that it's been a really gratifying experience to publish the book. And one thing that has happened is that new material has come to light. So a few months after I published the book, I was contacted by someone who I'd been in touch with throughout writing it that he had found letters sent to his great aunt, Rose Cohen. And you can see them here when a picture I took of them, and they're addressed to the Hotel Lux and to Rose Cohen's room 144. So um, that really is my kind of broad introduction, and I'm really looking forward to. And I must say, particularly speaking with Lisa Kirschenbaum, because I don't think that the book would really exist without Lisa's work, particularly on a methodological level. So then that's my final pitch as well, sales pitch. The book is available. And as well, if you'd like to keep up to date with my research, I keep a mailing list, a newsletter, and I send out a newsletter about once a month on different things I've found in archives and different grandchildren and grandnephews that I've been bothering. So that's everything from me. So really looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much. So before we proceed, let me remind those of you in the audience that if you wish to participate in the discussion with a question, you can use the raise hand function on Zoom, in which case you're put into a queue. I can call on you, you unmute yourself, and you can pose the question in your own voice, or you can use the question and answer function on Zoom, in which case you write out your question, and I, with my raspy voice, get to read it. So either way, you can get in the queue now. Our discussant this afternoon is Lisa Kirschenbaum, professor of history at Westchester University. She completed a PhD at the University of California, Berkeley, and she writes and teaches about modern Russia and the Soviet Union, war and memory, international communism, and gender in modern Europe. Her research is focused on the linkages between the personal and the political, investigating questions of how individuals, children who grew up in the wake of the Russian Revolution, survivors of the siege of Leningrad, volunteers in the international brigades, how they came to represent their life stories as part of history. She is the author of Small Comrades, Revolutionizing Childhood in Soviet Russia, 1917 to 1932, published in 2000, The Legacy of the Siege of Leningrad, 1941 to 1995, Myth, Memories, and Monuments, published in 2006, and International Communism and the Spanish Civil War, Solidarity and Suspicion, published in 2015. Lisa, welcome to the seminar.
Thanks. I want to mention that my most recent book, Tracing Ilfin Petrov's American Journey, it's called Soviet Adventures in the Land of the Capitalists. Joe Friedman has a cameo role in that book. He did help to show Ilfin Petrov, New York, and they thought his Russian was abysmal. In any case, it was a lot of fun to see a very different spin than the one they gave on Joe Freeman. So thank you so much for the invitation to talk about this book, which I enjoyed enormously. I think you got a really nice sense of what a rich and moving and human story the book tells. A really remarkable story of kind of transnational lives and loves focused around this key node in the Comintern network, the Hotel Lux in Moscow. And I think focusing on that hotel is a really valuable way to think about how an institution that was Soviet, that was founded by the Soviet state and the Comintern, they're the ones who appropriated the hotel and turned it into a dormitory for visiting, often long-term visiting foreign communists. So it's a state institution, but one in which all of this rich and strange cast of characters that goes through kind of helps to make. They are the people who were supposed to follow the rules, but didn't always do so, who were living, working, loving, gossiping in these spaces, who helped to make the Comintern not just how they wanted it to be, but also maybe not just how it was envisioned by the people at the top. Maurice gave us a really nice summary of this kind of astonishing cast of characters centered around Mayo Callahan, who's really the pivot of the story's central communist network. And it's just really a remarkable story, sort of beginning life in rural Ireland and then hobnobbing with the Soviet cultural sort of elites in the 1920s, the filmmaker Sergei Eisenstein, the poet Vladimir Mayakovsky. She surrounds herself with this chosen family, which includes Nellie and Rose Cohn and Emmy Leonhard and lots of other really, really fascinating people. As Maurice mentioned, it's really in large part owing to two of her other friends, Joe Freeman and Ruth Kennel, that he is able to get such a rich, fine-grained picture of their life, because those folks, she sent them incredibly, it sounds like often very detailed, sort of gossipy letters, and more remarkably, they saved them, and those letters were archived. So it gives us a possibility of getting at people who are the functionaries, the people who might show up in a footnote, but whose voices we usually don't hear in international history. So this copious correspondence that they saved, and as I think you very insightfully point out, that they saved it because of these networks of friendship and love, right? So they preserved these letters. You call this an intimate history, and I see that working in a few senses, and I want to come back to that idea and maybe hear a little bit more about that concept in the Q&A. It's intimate in the sense that it happens on a small scale in hotel rooms, and it allows us to see kind of some of the biggest, most monumental changes of the century from the perspectives of the little people and their everyday interactions. And is also, of course, intimate in the sense of taking really seriously personal spaces and relationships, family, romance, love, sex, and foregrounding issues of gender, sex, and sexuality. I think that's a really important thing to do in the history of international communism. The kind of communist revolutionary was always figured as quintessentially male, right? The metal worker or something like that. Despite the revolutionaries' very frequent and voluble commitments to women's emancipation, the revolution and its institutions were generally a man's world, right? Lenin's on the podium and the women are the stenographers. So much, right, a man's world that a lot of women, in order to kind of gain access to some of these revolutionary groups, would bob their hair, wear a leather jacket, pack a revolver, and take on behaviors that were coded as male, like smoking or sexual promiscuity. But Maurice has found this great way to give us not just the story of women in a man's revolution, but to really think about women who were making a revolution of their own, or trying to, in part by forming new kinds of relationships, new families, new kinds of romances, new ways of being in the world, and then works to recover the hopes and ideals that drew them to the Soviet project and the Soviet capital in the 1920s, its shortages and shortcomings notwithstanding. And so I think this focus on kind of new kinds of family bonds and new personal relationships is a really powerful way of thinking about what does revolution mean to individuals and also to communities. The story that you start with of May helping Emmy to get to the hospital and pay for the doctor is this really very materially powerful example of how those bonds were new. And this was a child born out of wedlock, which was a category that had been eliminated in the Soviet Union. So it gives us a sense of how those relationships are being remade, excuse me. You also reveal in a lot of, I think, really interesting ways, a kind of, you might say, persistent or annoying feature of the man's revolution, which is sort of the stubborn persistence of patriarchy within revolutionary networks and patriarchal ideas among male revolutionaries. So that piece in the 1920s is sort of packed with this kind of revolutionary hopes and dreams and remaking. And then the narrative shifts to a much darker period in the 1930s as we get the beginnings of the Stalinist terror. And I think with really a lot of sensitivity and insight, the book traces how so many of these people who witnessed firsthand sort of the opening shots in the Stalinist terror, how they managed to kind of remain connected to and believing in this project. And then in that last section where we get the sort of children's story, it's based on archival finds that I can only kind of describe as miraculous, that you found what you found, like that Alpen post and all those, but also those love letters, obviously, in the last case. And so the book at the end retraces the afterlives of this generation of 1920s radicals in this queer love story. And that, I think, is also a really important move that the book makes, because issues of sexuality are often a big blind spot in histories of international communism and of communist life stories. Communists were very loudly committed to emancipation of all kinds of groups that they understood as oppressed, whether that was workers or women or national or racial minorities or children. But the communists, especially in the 1930s, struggled a lot to accept their gay comrades. So this story at the end gives us a kind of more hopeful, maybe, outlook and the love of these daughters of communists from the 1920s who became part of this communist family. So I have a few questions, and I was going to maybe try and pose them one at a time and give you a chance to answer. So my first one is really to ask you to speak a little bit more on this concept of an intimate history. I'm very sympathetic to this idea. When I was working on my book on Spanish Civil War and international communism, I sort of half-jokingly told people that I was writing the gossip history of the Comintern. So I think that there's a lot to be gained by writing what I called the gossip history. But I'd like to hear a little bit more about how you conceptualize intimate history. It's about everyday life, but it's also about intimate relationships, and especially issues of sex and sexuality, which are often sort of just beyond a historian's reach, often, right? Things that even in the most intimate sources we don't often get, or we get in language that is very different, and in conceptual ways are very different from what we know. So what are some of the benefits or the potential problems of doing this kind of history? And how do you respond to critics, not me, but people who might be out there, that this is an approach that misses, in some sense, what the Comintern was, which was a political institution, that to sort of paraphrase older critics of social history, that this is history with the politics left out, that this intimate history of the Comintern does it take into account in some ways the political institution or the endless political infighting, which for a lot of people is kind of a defining feature of the Comintern. So is that a problem, or how do you see this sort of idea of an intimate history fitting into that kind of understanding of the Comintern?
Great. I mean, thanks so much, Lisa. I mean, it really means a lot to hear all of your comments. It's just really, really fantastic and really vindicating in terms of my whole project. So the methodology, history of intimacy methodology, in terms of like fleshing that out and understanding it, and I guess in a way that can also speak to the second part of your question about does this miss the political? George Morris, who wrote this great review article on what is the history of intimacy, he establishes this really useful concept of intimate practices, which are kind of like looking for like a small scale intimate unit of analysis that you can track across different spheres. One of the things that I think about this through is through these children, both of whom, as you referred to, the two kind of children central to the book, both of them are born out of wedlock, which is a category, a legal category that doesn't exist in the Soviet Union after the family law of 1919, I believe. And so going to the Soviet Union and raising a child outside of this, beyond the stigma, is an important, what you call intimate practice for these women within this network. But it's also one that's transferable across the network, which is why when Mayo Callahan learns that her friend Nellie is pregnant and she initially wants to bring her to Russia but cannot go to Russia, she decides to bring Nellie to New York. And in New York, her network in New York, it's Joe Freeman, it's all of her old friends from the Hotel Lux. And what this allows her to do is to experience the lack of shame and stigma, to experience the social mores of her world in Moscow, but in New York. So it's this transferable kind of intimate practice. And in that sense, I feel like it is another angle into the political, not necessarily an approach that's blind to the political, but it's understanding how these two factors of a kind of a personal life, a very human relationship of caring for a child interacts with this revolutionary project. And Mayo Callahan writes this wonderful, very analytically useful letter to Ruth Kennel right when she learns of Nellie's pregnancy, where she talks about how she wants to go to Russia where children are no longer considered illegitimate. She uses all of these kind of euphemisms, which are about Soviet women's progress, basically to tell Ruth and to inform Ruth that Nellie has become pregnant with the child of a famous novelist. So I think that rather than ignoring the political, it is showing how factors that are less considered within Comintern history, like parenting, are in fact innately political and shaped by it. I also think that what was so striking during this research, and again, it's something you've spoken about as well, is how these social bonds also become the vector for the terror. And so these kind of connections, these intimate connections, are not something that the Comintern itself considered entirely immaterial. In fact, social connections with people who were outcasts or heretics or so on mattered. They were really life and death almost. So I hope that kind of tackles those kind of questions.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think it's a really great way to think about it. Kind of related to that, I wanted to ask a little bit more about your sources. You have these amazing finds, everything from this Alpen post to amazing caches of letters, some of which are in university or state archives, a lot of which were in private hands, and a lot of that's, of course, specific to your own people and your own project. But I guess I'm thinking about this as being sort of an AHA kind of event, thinking about what is sort of maybe transferable to other projects that other historians are doing? Like, what can other historians take from your methodology? And I guess I'm thinking about this in two ways. One is actually just the logistical piece of finding the sources. I think your kind of detective story chapters in the book are a lot of fun and really interesting for a professional historian to read. Are there ways in which the steps that you took to locate some of those things, something that other historians can learn from? Is this replicable, or are there ideas for how to do this kind of history? And then the second piece of it is thinking about using these sources once you get your hands on them, especially when they're very rich. They tend, historians, to give into what you call the illusion that they reveal people's innermost thoughts or convictions. But as you also note, of course, they don't. Memoirs are fictionalized. Letters presume a reader. They sometimes presume a censor. They're always, to some extent, a performance or a construction of the self. So how do we resist that temptation to read these kinds of sources, which we feel like we're holding them in our hands? We now know these people. We can hear their voices. How do we resist that temptation to think now we have a clear window into their innermost thoughts? How do we do that? What do you look for as you read? What can we and can't we learn from this personal correspondence, which is always, in some ways, not wholly or only personal or revelatory? So, what do we do with these sources once we find them? How do we read them usefully and without seeing too much in them?
Mm. So in terms of replicable approaches, and I guess it also kind of links back into the second part of the question, I was very fortunate, or rather, not just fortunate, but I kind of intentionally chose a world of people who were very literary. And so there was style to their letters, but there was also reference points that you could use. And these were people who were very interested in literary modernism. They all read Joyce. And so there's reference points there that allow you to kind of get at their various allusions. And Mail Cohen writes one very useful for me, again, analytically letter, which is directly mimicking Joycean style. So I think if you want to write a very lively collective biography, focus on people who are good writers, which is seems like a kind of an obvious point, but actually it matters. Also, in terms of thinking about the correspondence archives themselves, I think what often gets overlooked, because we tend to go to personal papers because we're interested in the person whose archive it is. But incoming correspondence can be really, really rich and really, really interesting. And in fact, often personal papers are actually dominated by incoming correspondence. So it's these kind of random figures. And, with Joseph Freeman, for example, his archive is vast in the Hoover Institution. And I was very fortunate, because of the Fulbright, that I got to spend really 2 months there just going through all of these letters. And I discovered so many of the kind of different cast of characters through spending that really detailed, long amount of time with those letters. And again, it allowed me to do something as well, which gets to your question about how useful are these letters? How can we be careful about using them? One thing is also the ability with a rich correspondence network to kind of triangulate, to read people discussing each other and discussing their own correspondence and what they're leaving out, and the different omissions as well that they might tell another friend, which they won't reveal to the person they're directly speaking to. With Joseph Freeman, I often think of him because, I started really researching this. I was 23 years old, I guess, 22, 23. And he was 28 when he was in Moscow. So as a 23-year-old, I was reading about this 28-year-old, and I thought, well, he was a fully grown adult, of course. But then I sat down to write the book at the age of 30. Now I was looking back at a 28-year-old, and then I realized, oh, actually, he was like a baby. He was just like an idiot. And suddenly all of that kind of insinuation in May's letters about him really came to the surface, and I could finally understand this dynamic, which was kind of one about age as well and generational difference. So My advice, an ungenerous way of looking at my advice would be as fortunate as I was in the kind of richness of the correspondence. But in a way, you do need to be persistent and you need to drill down. I've always been astonished by how much there is. And I would remind people who feel like they're hitting a wall with someone that when I began researching Mayo Callahan, the only scholarly reference to her described her simply as a mystery woman. But if you keep searching, you'll always be surprised by what you can find.
Yeah, I used Millie Bennett's papers at the Hoover Institute, and they're also very extensive. And one of the things that Millie did was she would have 6 or 7 drafts of a single letter. You never knew which one, if any, she actually sent, but you could see her going through the process of figuring, and she was a journalist, so she was a good writer, and she had this sort of very hard-boiled self-presentation, but you could see her kind of cooking up the stories for different people. My last question is really thinking about the kind of contemporary significance of this story. At the outset, you ask, why am I seeking historical justice for a lost world of communists and revolutionaries? And then later, you identify these people as your political ancestors. So I want to ask, sort of, have you been able to find in their stories a usable leftist past? Is there something more there than a cautionary tale of totalitarian terror? And how has recreating the messy stories of these ancestors affected you, whether that's personally or professionally or politically? What relevance do their stories have for us in our current, shall we say, unsettled political moment?
Yeah, it's a kind of a question that I opened at the beginning of the book, and I never really felt like I've quite resolved in a way. I do think that the book is ultimately a story about hope and political determination, and the that there's kind of a richness and value in the lives of those who've committed to these projects, but also that there always needs to be a kind of a reckoning with the missteps and the euphemisms that our political ancestors used. The book again was and I come back to that anecdote about what age I was when I started the book. You know, I grew up in a way with the book because I wrote it in those kind of years during your 20s when you're really trying to figure out what your kind of belief system is. And so my own political beliefs are kind of an amalgam of all of these people all at once. And so I think through the contemporary world in those terms. And where it has left me is with a sense of the importance of your political principles reaching out into your wider community and into your family and your friendship networks and thinking, how do I apply these principles? In some senses, I think that people on the left might find that a kind of a an analysis that's at fault, because I think that a lot of people want to look at the history of the Comintern and think, how do we build a giant international leftist organization? My book, I think, won't answer that question, but I hope it will answer these questions about lived experience and what value there is to be gained from a life of total commitment. So I'm always interested to hear what kind of readers have gotten from the book, and that's been kind of answer the second part about what the experience has been of writing it. It's been enormously kind of gratifying to hear readers and their own kind of reflections and how it has given them a sense of lightness in what does feel like a dark time. And I think the story that really impacts people is that of the Alpenpost, which is this children's newspaper, and I guess that insight that these 2 girls who were growing up had this peripatetic life and they were just young teenage girls. But they wrote this newspaper which was full of joy and humor and precocious anti-Nazi analysis, all the while their family was ostensibly hunted. I think that the tenacity and the persistence of that kind of sense of political hope is something that I think resonates today. So that was a kind of rambling answer to that question.
Thank you very, very much. We're going to now open this up. Remember, you can use the raise hand function on Zoom, or you can use the Q&A function. Lewis Cooper has a hand up, and if you would unmute yourself, you can pose the question directly. Go ahead.
I haven't read the book, and I don't really know anything about these figures beyond what I heard in today. And I just had a quick question about their ideological evolution. For example, I noticed that Mayo Callahan lived into her 90s. Did she remain a committed communist until the end of her life? And I guess I have the same question about Freeman. Yeah, okay, I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Lewis. Yeah, one of the threads of the book really is looking at everyone's ideological evolution beyond the 1920s. Freeman is an interesting case. He described himself. He was an ex-communist, but never a kind of God that failed type communist who wrote a denunciation of his past experience. He was more or less isolated within the party after the publication of his memoir in 1937. Then he finally leaves the party in 1939 in the wake, so he writes, of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. He continues to describe himself as, what is his terminology? Like out of the party, but within the fold, essentially still on the left and believing in his original ideals. And what I found interesting working with his archive is that a lot of this is refracted through the fates of people who he knew in the Hotel Lux. And his sense that were he to publicly renounce his communism, it would be a betrayal of those who sacrificed their lives in what he saw as his understanding of that cause as a kind of a humanist ideology. Mayo Callahan died at the age of 92 in a nursing home in North London, and she was always. What's remarkable about her correspondence, and there's hundreds and hundreds of letters written by her. She never once refers to Stalin or Lenin. She refers to Trotsky only because there was a rumor, which she said was untrue, that she was a Trotskyist. So the revolution for her was something that was about culture. It was about women's emancipation. And once those ceased to be practical concerns in her everyday life, once she had returned to London and was living as effectively a retired woman who worked several days in a bookstore, she never made pronouncements on politics. I believe she settled into a kind of a social democrat position, and always kind of laughed at how her friends, who she still knew from those days, remained so dogmatic. What is more troubling, and something which I just opened the question of because it's harder to resolve, is how May and Nellie Cohen confront, or rather fail to confront, the death of Rose Cohen, Nellie's younger sister, who was executed in 1937 during the terror. So each of the characters that I focus on in the book goes on a different journey. Emmy Leonhard was a active Trotskyist from 1928, and then ends up using reparations payments that she got from the German government after the war to self-publish really a anarchist manifesto, which she's working on into her 80s. So there are all these different various paths that people take, and I'm interested as well in how intimate encounters also shape those paths, like Joseph Freeman refusing to ever renounce his communist faith because of the people he'd known and loved in the 20s. So yeah, the short answer is that it's a very long answer, and it's individual to each life.
Thank you. So I have to say, I found this absolutely fascinating and engrossing. And I have many questions. But I want you to stick with, just for a moment, Joseph Freeman, whose testimony got you started tracking down some of your biographical subjects. And so you just mentioned that he leaves the party, but he himself is under suspicion, you show. His book is subject to its own trial in Moscow. It is found wanting on so many different fronts. And so essentially he becomes somewhat persona non grata and has to leave the party. But he doesn't turn on it because of these friendships. There are others who, and I'm thinking of someone else whose papers are at Hoover, Eugene Lyons, who work in Moscow in the 1930s. He's a journalist and finds himself increasingly uncomfortable as the decade wears on, comes back to the United States, starts sharing some of his feelings, and he is subjected to, the full-on hostile treatment by people who were at one point his friends or his comrades. But he, unlike Freeman, shifts over completely and becomes a rabid, fierce anti-communism. But he too is doing so from, I think, what he would call a principled perspective, that he has concluded that the party that he served as a journalist had betrayed many of those ideals. Could you contrast these figures or just say a little bit more about Freeman's own trajectory? And then I want to talk a little bit about some of the key women in the book.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. And another interesting figure I think to bring into the discussion as well is Whittaker Chambers, who Joseph Freeman actually interviews and hires onto the Daily Worker, I believe, in the early 1930s. Chambers, for those who are unfamiliar, becomes a kind of a leading figure of the American kind of intellectual conservative movement, but was a very well regarded communist writer. He wrote these kind of short stories and poems that were really highly regarded within the New Masses, the cultural journal, but was also involved in networks of Soviet espionage, which is part of his renunciation as well. That's also kind of another pathway, which is to not only renounce your former faith, but also to reveal a kind of a clandestine and seedier, I guess, side to it. So Freeman, I think, always felt that there was a kind of a pure idea pushing him through his life, what he called, and he was a poet, or saw himself as a poet first and foremost, before politics, before writing, although his poetry wasn't as widely regarded as some of his literary writing. And he had this phrase about the basic dream with the changing name. And so that basic dream is the kind of emancipation of all humankind. And in the 1920s, it was called communism. In the 1930s, it was called something else. In the 1940s, it was something else again. Now, fortunately for Freeman, he felt like he always found the kind of evocation of that dream in whatever period he found himself in. But I guess there's a kind of a very literary distinction at work, and kind of Freeman's contrasting himself to someone, or contrasting himself with the work of someone like Lyons, or the kind of trajectory of someone what Lyons, and that he felt that there was always a kind of a poetic truth to his belief in the world revolution, and it wasn't a journalistic truth that he had never announced. He felt that he had never lied, in effect, because what he had been supporting was what he always believed in. Whereas I think for someone like Lyons, who felt that they had kind of served misinformation or misdirection, I think that was I don't know, I'm kind of guessing or kind of conjecturing because I'm not as familiar with Lyons' biography, but I just know that there was this sense that Freeman felt that he didn't have anything to apologize for, because he felt that he'd always been true to his principles and that he could always remain so. And again, the party left him behind, but in a way that allowed him to still remain on the left.
Well, if you were to ever write a biography of Lyons, I would buy it and read it immediately. I would really look forward to that. You do a really spectacular job recreating these lives. And I am a biographer, and I was just in awe and in complete envy of what you were able to accomplish just in terms of reconstructing the emotions, the emotional entanglements, the friendships, the rivalries. It really is something. But I want you to reflect upon something, and I think Lisa touched upon this, about what's in and what's not in this correspondence. And what struck me reading it is that or what your account of it is, that it's incredibly rich, A, and B, it's very personal. But what it's not is C, very political. And there is one major exception in the book that's absolutely fascinating, and it's Emmy Leonhard, who by this point is not in the party, and she is not in the Soviet Union anymore, and she's in Trotsky's world, and she's asked to say some words, give me a few lines about, what's going on, and she writes this like long tome, political analysis, holding her own with Leon Trotsky. So there we get politics. But what struck me with so many of the other figures is that they're not talking about the dreams, the visions, the politics that are driving them, that have brought them to Moscow or to wherever they are in the world, and in whose service they have put their energies and, in fact, their lives. So was this a choice that you made and what you focused on, or was the correspondence truly more focused on the personal and not the political? And if not the political, why not? Was this something that they reserved for the late night heavy drinking episodes, at the Hotel Lux, that they didn't need to get it out in print? But I was just curious, and if you could just explore that dimension of politics and or its absence, I'd appreciate.
Thanks, Eric. It's a really interesting question. Yeah. So, and when I found that letter that Emmy wrote, this long letter to Leon Trotsky, I was so glad of it, because it felt as though it was something that I was looking for a long time, which was a long, lengthy letter from one of my main figures, and I would say one of my main women figures. I'll circle back to that point, really just outlining, these are my politics, this is my understanding of the international situation, this is what needs to happen next. That was rare in personal correspondence, but I will say that in a way that is gendered, and in a way that I think reflects how men and women were instructed to how they were instructed to, I guess, consider themselves within the movement. I think very infrequently, because so much of my writing is based on kind of correspondence pairs, very few of my citations are actually men writing to men. But if I was to go back and look at all of my citations of men writing to men, I guarantee you a lot of those citations are political letters. So I'm just thinking of it that way, and I think that there is a nature in which people were told not to talk more broadly, but specifically instructed in personal correspondence. And that plays out, I think, in my source space. And I think it's just a kind of a reflection that I'm now having upon my book, which you've kind of prompted, which is, I guess, the kind of joy of these seminars. On another level, there is political writing, which tends to be in a kind of public-facing journals. And what I was always interested in was the kind of the political and the personal moments, which, again, a lot of them were kind of clever enough to understand they were writing into these letters too. So yeah, I mean, it's a kind of a question that I'm going to need to sit with for a long time. But I think my kind of initial response is that, firstly, no, there's not kind of huge political discussions that I'm hiding, or rather I'm overlooking or didn't think relevant. They weren't there in the letters generally. And two, I think the reason that they weren't there is a gendered construction within the movement itself.
Fascinating. Thank you. So we have a anonymous attendee who finds this a truly interesting account, but is curious about your starting point. 1924. So if you could say something about the chronological parameters of the book, how you began it, where you ended it, for our anonymous attendee and everyone else.
Yeah, so beginning points. Well, the book, I begin the kind of discussion of the Hotel Lux with 1924 because that's when Mayo Callaghan arrived. So the kind of structural reason for that is that the book really begins in East London, I guess, with her life in East London, and then kind of reflects a little bit on what brought her there and her life in Ireland as well. Now, the book is structured in a way that it's not a biography of this woman, Mayo Callaghan, but I did think of her as the kind of point of view character. So I don't introduce any characters into the book until the point at which they met her. So she becomes the kind of reader's point of introduction to various people. Um, Again, so that's what leads us to 1924. It's simply the time when she arrived, and it was just one of those kind of fortunate circumstances for me where I could see that she arrived in 1924, she leaves in 1928. It's a perfect, useful kind of chronology for a certain period in the history of international communism. And the book then ends really on the death of Mayo Callaghan, and it has a kind of a circular structure, which I think I've kind of indirectly imbibed from a teenage love of Catch 22 and that book structure. So I think there's a bit of that in there too. But yeah, so 1924, it's not really a beginning point. It's really when Mayo Callaghan arrived, and she is she is the spine. She's the structural spine of the book itself.
As a reader, I thought that worked very well. I just have to say. We have a comment from Mark Plaushin, who says, super interesting and helpful to me in my own work. Did you find and or write about indicators of illness, emotional, physical, chronic, etc., emotional maturity or lack thereof, or metaphysical belief systems, and how these shaped the lives of your characters?
Mhm. Thank you. Yeah, really interesting question. Yes, in answer to it, and one of the interesting ones which I'll speak about is Edo Fimmen. So Emmy Leonhard, who we've spoken about, her partner Edo Fimmen, Dutch trade unionist. Um, I found in Edo's grandsons, amongst the papers that Edo's grandson had, all of these doctor's notes from the late 1930s, and they really showed that Edo had suffered a real physical and psychological collapse in the late 1930s because he felt, as the leader of one of Europe's major trade unions, that the fate of European trade unionism rested upon his shoulders, and that the rise of fascism was in a way a his responsibility. And the doctor recognizes this and writes to Emmy. And she essentially said, the doctor essentially says, to use kind of contemporary terminology, you need to stop him doom scrolling, right? Obviously doesn't use those terms, but he says, your husband needs to read light detective novels. You need to stop him reading the news. So I found that really interesting that this doctor at that point was looking at this political man and saying that he's consuming too much political news and it's affecting him on a physical level. You need to extract him away from that world. So I found that really kind of striking material. In terms of emotional maturity, yes, that was one of the kind of key points at which the interactions between all these people began to make sense, was when I really sat down and looked at their ages and how that impacted the relationship of one to the other, and who, who, if someone was in their mid-20s when they were speaking to Mayo Callaghan was about 10 to 15 years older than kind of all the other central figures in the book. And so her perception and how others perceived her was as the most emotionally mature figure. And so that also is useful for my purposes because she was the people who others came to for kind of emotional counsel on their relationships. Metaphysical belief systems, that's one I'll need to think of more, one question which has never been fully resolved for me is that the Leonhard girls, so Elisa and Alida, who grew up on the refugee routes and wrote this newspaper, the Alpenpost, both convert to Judaism after the war. Have a secular upbringing, and not even Alida's son Pedro knows really why this happened, but it became a very important part of their identity. I'm sure there probably is a history there about a religious conversion of these two girls after the war. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Keith Harvey is writing in from Melbourne and asks if you came across any Australian communists at the Hotel Lux as part of your research.
Yes, I did. Esmond Higgins, a very interesting figure, and he's someone who's kind of come up twice. So I cite letters that Rose Cohen wrote to him. She wrote these letters from the hotel in 1923, and they were saying, I'm sorry, Esmond, I can't marry you. Let's just be friends. And she's really writing this a lot. So it was clear that he was writing to her, have you reconsidered? Will you marry me? And those letters were kindly copied for me from Higgins's archive, which is in University of New South Wales. But in any case, so that material was there. More recently, when the picture of the letters that I showed you, the letters that I found recently to Rose Cohen in those two envelopes that I found back in November, they are actually the other side of that correspondence. So it's Esmond Higgins writing, I love you, I want to be with you, I want to marry you. So these really kind of, overwrought letters. So he traveled to Moscow. He also had, what was interesting for me, he had a kind of he made a choice. He cycled around Ireland before he traveled to Moscow, and then he kind of sat with both ideas and was like, am I going to be an Irish Republican or am I going to be a communist? And decided to become a communist. Other Australians, I don't come to mind, but Esmond Higgins is an interesting figure. He was really a British Party member, but he did return and did join the Australian Communist Party as well. But at first, he was a British Communist Party member. But yeah, thank you for that. One time in a Q&A, someone asked me if I'd come across anyone from Leitrim, which is a really rural county in Ireland. And I was shocked at the specificity of that question. So I'm glad I had an example for you of an Australian.
Great, thanks. Shauna Gilligan writes, fascinating book. This is a term that has come up a number of times. Following on from these great questions, how can the historian explore the silence behind these letters, particularly, as you point out, the lack of recorded reaction to those who were killed either by the Nazis or the Stalinist purges? And there's a second question, a separate question, that is there cause to further explore May's family reaction to her communist work?
Mm. Well, thank you. Thanks, Shauna. So I'll begin backwards. May's family and her communist work. May was from a middle-class Catholic family. Her father was a Royal Irish Constabulary constable. Both of her parents predeceased her turn to communism. Her father died in 1916. What I've been most interested in is to try and piece together her relationship with her sisters. She had two sisters, one of whom married an Austrian businessman, which is frustrating for me because she then loses the surname, and I've been unable to trace her after that. But the most fascinating relationship for me is her youngest sister, Bridget, who became a nun, but was always friends with May. And there's letters that Emmy writes in the 1960s. Emmy, after the war, settled in Switzerland. It turned out that May's sister, the nun, ended up in a convent in Locarno. So when May would visit Emmy, which was quite often after the war, she would also visit her sister. I would love to find out something more. It's often been kind of on my to-do list to try and see if I could figure out what became of her sister and if I could try and trace where this convent was, because I'm really struck by that idea of these two women, two sisters, neither of whom who had fallen out of touch with one another, one of whom was a traveler in the Comintern and the other of whom was a nun. And there's a lovely picture, or like a kind of neatly symbolic picture of May sitting on the wall of Novodevichy convent, which the Bolsheviks had transformed into the Museum of Women's Liberation. So I'd love to unpick that more, but unfortunately, there's kind of no real source that we can dig into aside from conjecture. I did visit her village and met an older man in his 80s who had actually met her in the 1930s as a boy and remembered Mayo Callahan visiting home. But he said that there was no memory in the town of May having had this political life. Silence behind the letters. I think, again, something about the something that's useful about talking about yourself, I think, in historical work and using kind of personal pronoun I is actually to underline this, to underline the gaps and the silences. I think it's harder narrative wise to kind of you often just elide them if you're just doing kind of I guess third person writing. Whereas I think actually kind of you can sit with them more by pointing them out. You can talk about the kind of intertextuality of the sources themselves. For example, when I found the last letter that Nellie wrote to her sister Rose, I believe she wrote this letter to her sister Rose and dated it 2 days after Rose's arrest, something like that, not knowing that Rose had been arrested. And that letter had then obviously made its way to Moscow and then been returned to sender, and which is why I found this letter in an attic in the Cotswolds outside of in about 3 minutes from Oxford. But someone, I believe it was Joyce Nelly's daughter, had then wrapped that letter in a torn out page from a biography which had written about Rose's disappearance. So there's all these kind of strange kind of family rituals involved there. Why did she hold on to the last letter that she sent her sister that returned to sender? And then why did her daughter then read about Rose's fate, tear that page out, and then wrap that letter in it? So I, I think that what we can do as historians is simply open those questions, right? And in a kind of a writing style that allows us to do so by just, saying that there's no neat conclusion to this, but it's we can just think on it. And yeah, so again, I'm interested in these kind of loose ends and what we can do with them.
So, on the issue of writing style and narrative strategy, something that is fairly distinctive about the book is your participation in the book as not a character, but you appear in various pages to walk us through the process of how you came to uncover what you uncovered and assemble the story that you assembled. I'm thinking of Daniel Mendelssohn's book, The Lost, in which his journey is at the center of his story. Scott Nelson, his book on searching for John Henry, Steel Driving Man, he too, takes us through back roads, driving and explores his own involvement in the research process. How and why did you decide to make that a part of this particular story? I think it works incredibly well. I think graduate students should be assigned, if perhaps the whole book or at least those sections, because it provides kind of a unique angle into your efforts to reconstruct a world that one would think is not reconstructible, and yet you pull it off wonderfully. So how and why did you
Oh,
decide to be a character in your own book?
well, thanks so much, Eric. That's really nice. That's really generous of you. It was about, I think it was about it came back to my genesis as a historian, which was as an undergrad, reading these quite dry secondary literature. But then I had a tutor who told me, for this essay, you need to go into the archives. You need to look at primary source material, like in the archives itself, not on a computer screen. Go into the archives. And I saw these letters. At that time, I was reading about 1920s Irish Republicans, and I realized the letters were so rich with the texture of human life, and I couldn't understand this alchemy that had caused these really fascinating letters to end up boring me so much across the road in the university library. But I was interested in the book then in trying to convey my excitement of finding material. And Lisa used the term earlier that there were some miraculous discoveries in the book, and there really were. And I didn't want to just slip over those moments, which helped me understand the story I was telling, um, without interjecting and saying this is amazing, like this is actually so rare. And I think as well, uh, people who have never this I've had reactions from readers who'd never considered how historians put things together. And so as well, I wanted to kind of pull back the curtain a bit and show people that kind of process. So it was really about trying to transmute the excitement that had first led me to be a historian in the first place. But also to as well, hopefully, and that's really particularly really generous of you to say that it should be assigned to grad students, because I do hope that there might be something there in terms of thinking through how we do history. And it's become more a part of my academic work as well. I'm giving a paper here in Cambridge on Friday, specifically about how historians work with family archives of families that are not our own, particularly when we encounter family secrets. So it's a kind of a question that I'm turning over and is really becoming kind of central to my work.
Thank you. So I want to pose another, perhaps even larger question, and this has to do with the book and where you situate it within the broader historiography. And I'm thinking of another book that recently came out, Maurice Isserman, the other Maurice Isserman's book, Reds, which is a synthetic study. He's been writing on the history of communism for 40-something years. And he has moved from the revisionist camp more toward the conservatives or the traditionalists that he once critiqued. And it's clear, and he wrote an essay in The Guardian, that a friend read the book and said, you seem much more impatient, with the people you're writing about than you once did so many decades ago. And that absolutely comes across in its pages. So you establish that these individuals, and this fits into the revisionist framing, aren't automatons. They don't behave the way in which we think they should behave based on their existence in a particular category. Some people still in the party actually still talk to those accused of Trotskyism, though others don't. But at the end of the day, I think the book can be read, and you can push back here or not. It does validate some of the traditionalists' framing. It's hard to walk away from your account of the Soviet side of things with anything other than, certainly by the end of the 30s and I think it was end of the 20s and the 1930s, as anything but with a sense of horror at what this system is, what the Comintern might be doing, and the larger vision that it's pursuing. And this is something that your characters don't come fully to grips with unless they split, either because they're accused of Trotskyism or they decide to be Trotskyists, and so they migrate out. But ultimately, the party that these people are serving, the state that they're serving, and you're very upfront about this, is a brutal state. Yet many of them don't fully come to grips with this. And I'm just sort of struck that the kind of the ideological framework that they're imprisoned in keeps them from seeing what's in front of them, keeps them from recognizing that Rose Cohen and so many of the people that they drank with, that they slept with, that they hang out with, that they had such conversations with, are dead, are killed. And so the traditionalists come away here and say, even though you want to kind of preserve, kind of the spirit of radicalism, and hopefulness, to a certain extent, they are betrayed by the system they are serving, and they may be betraying their own cause by not coming to grips with what they are encountering. Am I reading this the wrong way? Or how would you respond to that?
Well, thanks, Eric. It would be great if there was a feature on Zoom where we could split into breakout rooms, revisionists and traditionalists, and argue it out. It's really interesting. I haven't read Maurice Casey's book yet, but I'll be really interested to read that, both that and the essay. It reminds me of Vivian Gornick in her foreword to the reprint of Romance of American Communism, having a very similar reaction, being kind of confused that younger American leftists were now interested in those people, and how she felt she had given them far too much time and been far too kind to them. I think where I guess my primary interest is in trying to capture, not my primary interest, one of my major interests in the book is trying to capture the absolute contingency of the moment, the sense of multiple futures being open in that moment, and also trying to avoid the kind of closing off of those futures through hindsight, while also recognizing what actually happened. I guess what I'm trying to undermine with the book is determinist readings that it was always going to be this way. What I'm trying to also appreciate is how it is the movement and the state was a product of a particularly brutal time, a particular time of violence, and that the Bolsheviks were shaped by the violence of the Russian Empire, and they went on to kind of relitigate that violence upon the state that they took over. And my frustration then is both simultaneously with those who say that a project of human emancipation must always end up like this, and those on the left who say that we need to replicate precisely this brutal project of emancipation because it's the only way to do it. So what I'm searching for is a middle ground, not a middle ground, not a center position, but what I'm searching for is another way through this history that I guess tries to toe the line. Whether I'll be successful, I think we should have the kind of Washington history seminar when I'm 65, and we'll kind of play me back this conclusion and see if I still agree with it. I was really interested in one of the figures that I think really expresses this lesson from the book for me. I was trying to find examples of people who didn't grow more right wing as they grew older. And Amy Leonhard in the book is the kind of key example of someone who just kept growing more and more left wing. And something that I also was interested in was just how much that actually annoyed her children, and how they found it quite difficult to live with the mum who was constantly engaged in whatever revolution was around the corner. So there's pitfalls and downfalls, and it's a twisting, complex mess. But that's what made it all kind of so fascinating, so wonderful to research.
Terrific. I'm afraid, even though I would actually like to go on for much, much longer, I need to draw this to a close. But I will say to those in the audience that this is an immensely readable book. It was one of those books that I found myself like locked in my chair, not wanting to get up, and enjoyed it from the beginning to an end. It prompted me to think about subjects in new ways, and my appreciation for the research, the phenomenal research that allows you to reconstruct things that we would imagine wouldn't be reconstructible. I'm just envious of. So there's much more in this. So I would highly recommend to those in the audience that you should read it. And with that, I bring this to a close. I want to thank Maurice and Lisa for this great conversation. Remember, we reconvene next Monday on February 10th for a discussion of Elise Graham's Book and Dagger: How Scholars and Librarians Became the Unlikely Spies of World War II. And we convene, as always, at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. Hope you can join us. Thank you, everyone. Till then, take care. Good night.